In 2010, DC Comics released Superman Earth-1, the first of a line of original graphic novels that reimagine classic DC Comics characters for the modern audience without worrying about the years of backstory or any other titles that might get in the way of the story being told here. 2012 saw the release of Batman Earth-1, written by Geoff Johns and drawn by Gary Frank. I will try not to spoil this book, but I am going to be discussing it in depth to the best of my abilities. I went into this book with very low expectations. I have never been a fan of the works of Geoff Johns, and I expected this book to measure up to his other books, which would mean that I would not enjoy it at all. And I am a huge Batman fan, so I expected this book to rub me the wrong way even more, because it features a character that I love. I was shocked to discover that I actually really loved this book. I first read this shortly after Christmas last year, and when I was trying to think of something to review for this channel, I thought it would be a good idea to reread this and see if my love for it held after a second reading. I am happy to say that I still love the story, although I did have quite a few qualms that I will discuss as I review this thing in full. When I first read this book, I was afraid it was going to be going in a direction of, and this is what superheroes would really be like if they existed in the real world. After all, the first pages show an extremely incompetent Batman failing in every way possible in his quest to chase after what we later find out is a corrupt cop. I was afraid this was going to be a rebuttal to the way Batman has become a god in the eyes of fanboys since books like The Dark Knight Returns and JLA Tower of Babel. Batman can even defeat Galactus given prep time. And while I think many Batman victories imagined by creators and fans alike have slid into the absurd, I didn't really want to see Batman taken this far in the other direction, and I still wasn't extremely crazy about this drastic depowering of Batman on the second reading, but I can see why this was done. I think Geoff Johns wanted to show Batman's evolution into the Batman we know and love, so we start with a normal man. His gadgets don't work, and the only training that we know for certain that he has comes from Alfred. All that he has is his drive, which has always been the one aspect of Batman that I've admired the most. One thing I only noticed with the second reading of this book was how Batman suddenly seems to have a power-up before the third act and is suddenly competent enough to defeat the bad guy. Batman only goes out as Batman 3 times in this book. Once at the very beginning, when he falls off a roof and fails to capture his prey. Then again, when someone smashes a brick into his head and he falls off a roof and fails to capture his prey. And then the third time, he is suddenly competent enough to take down the Birthday Boy, who is about the size of the Incredible Hulk and looks about as strong. Incidentally, the Birthday Boy takes a bullet in the shoulder, and we see no indication that this caused him any pain. And Batman's punches also seem pretty useless. To quote Griff Tannen, "Since when did you become the physical type?" Alfred even mentions that the only reason Batman succeeded in this fight was that he was lucky. But there's luck, and then there's getting the star in Mario World and becoming invincible for a short period of time. I only assume that Batman found the star somewhere in the Arkham Mansion before facing the Birthday Boy. Otherwise, I'm sure we would have seen Batman fall off a roof again. This could have been done in a less drastic way if Johns hadn't depowered this Batman so hard. We understand that this is a Batman who is just beginning, and he's not there yet, but there is plenty of room in between the Batman we see here and the one who can defeat the Justice League with prep time in the DC Universe. The fact that Batman only goes out as Batman 3 times is a great segue into my next point. According to Amazon, this book is 144 pages long. It really doesn't feel like a long read when you're reading it, which is good. If you aren't taking a break and saying, "This feels really long," then that means that you're engaged in the story and you want to see what happens next. But when I read this the second time, I felt like it was too short. We really should have had another 15 or even 20 pages to make this story feel less truncated than what it does. Some things we maybe could have had more of would be another scene fleshing out Jim Gordon and Harvey Bullock's relationship, as I felt like they didn't quite have enough scenes to cement any kind of alliance when they finally joined forces at the end. We could definitely have had more scenes with Bruce outside of the Batsuit. We see him at the mayor's party briefly, and we see him talking with Lucius Fox. I definitely didn't get enough about this guy to make me want to care about him in any way. All we really get is just there to differentiate this Batman from the one in all of the other Batman books. And that's great, but we need more than that. With this book clocking in at 144 pages, I didn't really feel like there was much of a story here. True, we get to see the murder of the Waynes in the past, and how this transforms Bruce Wayne from a rich, spoiled brat into a crusader of vengeance, and how he changes from that into the more traditional protector focused on more than just vengeance. But other than that, what all is happening in this book? I've talked before about how a story really needs a protagonist with a set of goals and an antagonist with motives that are the opposite of the protagonist. If Charles Xavier wants to see a world where humans and mutants can all eat Cheerios together and smile, and Magneto wants to see a world where mutants eat Cheerios and humans eat poop, then there's a source of conflict, and a reason for there to be conflict, as these two men do not see eye to eye. Here, our protagonist is on a mission to find out the truth about the murder of his parents and bring the pain to whoever is responsible. And sure enough, Oswald Cobblepot doesn't want anyone to investigate this case. But you can't really look at everything Cobblepot does and say that his goal for this story is to keep the murder of the Waynes from being looked at too closely. His goal is to... I don't really know. He's already living large as the mayor, and a couple of times we hear that the Dent twins are attacking him through legal actions. But we don't get to see any of this. In fact, we barely get to see Cobblepot at all. This could have been less of a problem if we had another 20 pages or so of this book. I said in the past that it is okay if the antagonist and his goals are not in direct opposition to the goals of the protagonist, as long as, for some reason that doesn't feel too contrived, they both end up in opposition to each other anyway. And while that does happen in this book, I don't feel like it's enough. I wanted to see the Penguin doing something evil other than his attempts to maintain the status quo. And yes, he is employing a psychotic serial killer to kill people so that he isn't dethroned, but all of this really seemed like it was just a throwaway line that isn't explored very much because this book doesn't seem long enough. You may be wondering what I actually liked about this book. So far, I've only had criticisms, but I really did enjoy this book. I think what I enjoyed the most is the role reversal that many of the characters in this story play. We've known since the 1970s that Alfred Pennyworth fought in a war, but that's never really been used in any story that I've read. Here, that is brought to the forefront, and in a way where he is barely recognizable as the stuffy butler who is subservient to Bruce. And yet, even though he isn't that, he is still playing the same role. He's the father that Bruce didn't get to have, and he's the enabler for Bruce's Batman. The core is there, but the outer shell has changed so that we're getting a very different kind of story with this character. The same is done with Thomas and Martha Wayne. Before this story, I heard many times that the Waynes were lovely people who were involved in charities, but I never really felt like I knew anything concrete about them. Here, Thomas is running for mayor, and wants to take this city back from the scumbags. This is something concrete that we can root for, and it makes his death seem more tragic, even when we know it is coming. And what I love the most is that Martha Wayne gets equal screen time to Thomas. She's maybe the most unimportant character in the Batman comics. She and her husband both have always been just a vehicle for the creation of Batman. But here, she is involved with the rights of the mentally ill. This isn't as concrete as Thomas running for mayor, but it is leaps and bounds ahead of what the mainstream Martha has had. And making Martha one of the Arkhams is incredibly inspired. Since before I began reading comics, there's always been a hint that Batman is as crazy as the villains he fights. Earth 1 puts a heavier emphasis on that, as Martha clearly has some issues with her family, and Bruce also is rather sensitive in a flashback when it is suggested that he will go crazy like everyone else in his mom's family. Maybe what I'm looking forward to the most in future books in this series is the exploration of Batman's relationship to the Arkhams. The other two inversions we get are handled in a different way. With Alfred, Thomas, and Martha Wayne, we have characters who are actually fleshed out, or they have a trait that was never explored and is explored here. But with the two other characters that I'm talking about, the way they are handled is a little different. In a prequel, it is expected that a character acts completely opposite as to how they would act in whatever story the prequel is set before. This is why Jake Lloyd's Anakin Skywalker is an adorable little kid who we could never imagine becoming a genocidal madman. This is why Tom Welling's Clark Kent says he doesn't like flying and could never imagine wearing a large S on his chest. This is why James McAvoy's Charles Xavier is a flirtatious ladies' man and a man of action going into battle with his team. While Batman Earth 1 isn't exactly a prequel, it is setting the foundation of a new line of Batman stories, and so it is following the same rules that prequels do. We get to see the same treatment with Batman, for example. Instead of being, well, good at what he's doing, he really is not. But we see seeds of the hero we've seen him to be in other stories, and we are given hope that in later stories set in this world, he will get there. And we also see this put in place with Jim Gordon and Harvey Bullock. After Batman Year One, we've come to expect Jim Gordon to be the maverick cop who won't stand for corruption of any kind in his city. But when we see Jim Gordon in Earth 1, he is the cop who is content to let the status quo remain, and doesn't want to get involved with anything he knows he shouldn't mess with. This is a huge slap to the face for anyone who is familiar with the character, and just as we've come to expect this Gordon to be considerably less noble than what we are used to, without spoiling too much, we find that he's much closer to the classic Gordon that we all know and love. Likewise, for many years, we've come to expect Harvey Bullock to be a fat slob with no manners. We don't expect him to be slim, clean-shaven, and overly polite, and more concerned with his television show than upholding the law. But then we see the book subvert what it has shown us, and then yet again it subverts that, and all very naturally. In a way, I'm more pleased with the character progression of both Bullock and Gordon than I am with what was done with Batman in this book. I've talked about this book a great deal, and I probably could talk about it for a great deal longer, but I want people to read this book, and I've probably spoiled too much already for those who haven't read it. I fear that even though I consider this to be a very high-quality book, it will be overlooked years from now, and people will not give it its due. I only think this because of all the noise Superman Earth 1 made when it first premiered, and the considerably less flashy entrance Batman Earth 1 made. If you are curious about whether you should get this book, I would say go for it. I don't think you'll be disappointed.